Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm excited to kick off today's presentation on fabrication. This session is part of our continuous learning development series for 2024. Today, we'll explore the fundamentals of fabrication, its processes, and how it impacts our work. We'll also look at some best practices and innovative techniques. So let's get started and dive into this fascinating topic together. Today, I want to discuss an important aspect concerning fabricated narrations about the Prophet Piba, known as Madu. If a narrator is known to lie about the Prophet Piba, then his hadiths are classified as Madu, which means they are not authentic at all. In fact, technically, a Madu narration isn't even a genuine hadith. It's essentially a lie attributed to the Prophet Piba. Sometimes, people refer to these as hadith figuratively, but they are not acceptable to transmit. Now, regarding the ruling on narrating such fabrications, the consensus among scholars is very clear. It's not permissible to narrate any hadith that is known to be fabricated, unless you explicitly point out that it is fabricated. This is crucial to prevent misinformation. Let's talk about how we can recognize fabricated narrations. One method is through the confession of the fabricator himself. For example, there was a person named Abu Isma ibn Abi Maryam who admitted that he fabricated hadiths about the virtues of each surah in the Quran and falsely attributed them to Ibn Abbas. Another way is through indirect confession. Say someone narrates from a teacher, and when asked about their own date of birth, they mention a date after the death of their teacher. If the hadith is only transmitted by this person, we automatically classify it as Madu, because it clearly indicates inconsistency or fabrication. We also look at circumstantial factors related to the narrator. For instance, if the narrator is known to be a Shiite, and the hadith concerns the virtues of the Prophet's descendants, that raises suspicion about its authenticity. Similarly, if the wording of the hadith is grammatically weak, or if its content contradicts the core messages of the Quran, these are signs that the hadith might be fabricated. In summary, recognizing Madu requires careful attention to these indicators, and it's vital for us to be cautious and responsible in transmitting hadiths, always prioritizing authenticity and truth. Let's take a closer look at the attribution of false statements to the Prophet, which can be categorized into two main types. First, there is the intentional fabrication of hadith, often referred to as hadith Madu. Those who commit this serious sin fall into different groups. Some, like the Zinduks, couldn't openly oppose Islam, so they disguised their opposition under the guise of scholarship. The second category is unintentional attribution, known as hadith battle. This happens when people, despite taking care, accidentally attribute a false hadith to the Prophet. It can also occur due to carelessness. Interestingly, some individuals with weak minds or good intentions might have fabricated hadiths without fully understanding the consequences. Understanding these distinctions helps us grasp the importance of verifying hadiths and maintaining the integrity of Islamic teachings, especially in the context of protecting the authenticity of our sources. On this slide, we see an important discussion about the dangers of fabricating hadiths. Abu Umara al-Marwaz mentions a specific incident where Abul Isma was asked about a report from Ikrimah and Ibn Abbas regarding the excellence of the Quran surah by surah. Interestingly, he pointed out that Ikrimah's students did not have this knowledge, which highlights how scholars often cross-reference and scrutinize reports to detect falsehoods. Abul Isma explained that he had observed people turning away from the Quran and instead focusing on other pursuits like fiqh of Abu Hanifa or the Maghazi of Muhammad b. Ishaq. Out of concern, he admitted that he fabricated some hadiths himself, seeking reward in the hereafter. This brings us to a critical point. There were storytellers, some standing in markets or mosques, who falsely attributed hadiths to the Prophet. Some fabrications were made for rulers' benefits, while others were driven by sectarian motives, whether in law, theology, politics, or personal prejudice. It's important to understand that these fabrications, especially when done intentionally, distort the true teachings of Islam. They threaten the integrity of our religion and require us to be vigilant in verifying sources. The overall theme here reminds us that fabricating hadiths, whether for personal gain or out of prejudice, is a serious issue that scholars have always fought against. There are, however, other people who committed mistakes, even though they did not intentionally fabricate the statements themselves. Some took well-known hadiths and changed their wording slightly, just for the sake of novelty, hoping to attract attention and become a focus for learning. Then there are scholars who made errors during transmission. For example, they might have incorrectly attributed sayings to the Prophet when, in fact, those statements belonged to the companions or successors. Sometimes, they ended their isnad with a companion or successor and mistakenly thought the statement was from the Prophet himself. We also see pious individuals who, out of devotion, did not pay enough attention to accuracy or dedicate sufficient time to studying hadiths. Their busy worship and devotion sometimes led them to transmit hadiths incorrectly, simply because they lacked the necessary care and precision. Another common mistake involved scholars who learned hadiths from certain teachers and later discovered that those teachers had also transmitted other hadiths they had missed. Instead of being content with what they had learned directly and carefully, they sometimes transmitted everything they knew, pretending they had direct knowledge of all those sayings. There are also cases where people learned from authoritative books, but didn't write down or memorize what they learned at the time. As they grew older, when asked about hadiths, they would try to recall from memory or from copies of the books they had, which sometimes lacked proper notes or verification. Their desire to appear knowledgeable could lead them to transmit information without certainty. Some individuals lack the proper qualifications for teaching hadith, like a sharp memory, alertness, or access to reliable texts. When a student came and recited hadiths to them, they might have accepted and transmitted those hadiths without realizing they were not authentic, simply because they didn't have the tools to verify. There were also scholars who traveled extensively in search of hadiths and were recognized as reputable muhaddithin. However, they might have lost their original collections of books. Later, when teaching, they relied on copies other than their own, which could have had differences or errors. Sometimes, they transmitted from their faulty memories, leading to guesswork and potential inaccuracies. It's important to remember that the value of what they taught depended heavily on whether their sources were sound and reliable. All these mistakes highlight the importance of careful verification and precise transmission in preserving the authenticity of hadiths. When we talk about detecting fabricated hadiths, it's important to understand the key indicators that can help us identify false or unreliable narrations. One major sign is if the hadith contains exaggerated statements that the Prophet could not have made. For example, there's a false hadith attributed to the Prophet claiming that when someone says, La ilaha illallah, God creates a bird with 70,000 tongues from that sentence. Such exaggerations are clear red flags. Experimentation or logical testing can help reject these kinds of claims because they sound ridiculous and are not consistent with our understanding of Islamic teachings. These attribution errors often seem nonsensical or exaggerated to the point of absurdity. They also contradict well-known sunnah, which we know from authentic sources. Another point to watch for is if a statement is supposedly made in the presence of 1,000 companions, but all of them allegedly concealed it. That's highly unlikely and suspicious. Similarly, if the wording of the hadith doesn't resemble the typical style of the Prophet's sayings, or if it sounds more like mystics or medical practitioners rather than Prophet Muhammad, that's a strong indication of fabrication. Furthermore, such hadiths often contradict clear and obvious meanings of the Quran, which is a critical red flag. They may also have an inadequate or awkward style that doesn't match the eloquence of authentic sayings. Beyond these points, scholars also examine the entire isnad, or chain of narration, to detect fabrication. They meticulously analyze each narrator's reliability and the connection between them to ensure the hadith is authentic. So, in summary, detecting fabricated hadiths involves looking for exaggerated or nonsensical claims, contradictions with Quranic teachings, stylistic inconsistencies, and scrutinizing the isnad carefully. All these methods work together to help us preserve the integrity of our Islamic teachings. On this slide, we see a quote attributed to the Prophet, where he states, "I am the seal of the prophets. There will be no prophet after me unless Allah wills." Now, this statement is often understood as a clear indication that Muhammad is the last prophet. However, the context and the way this hadith has been transmitted raise important questions. What's crucial here is that some scholars argue this statement was forged or manipulated to support certain heresies and false claims to prophethood that emerged later. Essentially, the claim was used to justify those who falsely claimed to be prophets after Muhammad by distorting or misusing this statement. This brings us to the concept of fabricated hadiths. These are false or falsely attributed sayings of the Prophet, and understanding their existence and influence is key to evaluating how Islamic teachings have been preserved and sometimes distorted. So, in the grander scheme of our discussion, recognizing these fabrications helps us see the importance of authentic sources and the dangers of misinformation. It also underscores the need for careful scholarship to distinguish genuine teachings from fabricated ones. Today, I want to address an important aspect of our learning about hadiths, the issue of fabrication. As you can see on this slide, many sayings attributed to the Prophet or other revered figures have been identified as fabricated or weak. For example, there's a narration that says visiting graves every Jumu'ah and reciting Surah Yasin over parents can forgive sins. However, it's graded as fabricated by Ibn Adi, meaning it lacks a reliable chain of narration. Similarly, there's a saying that Ali is the gate to knowledge, which is classified as fabricated by Imam Bukhari, indicating it's not authentic. We also see statements about differences among followers being mercy or women's role in worship, but scholars like Ibn Hazm and others have pointed out that these are not authentic hadiths. Some narrations encourage seeking knowledge as far as China, or advise burying the dead among pious people. Both are also fabricated, according to scholars like Ibn Jawzi. There are more, such as the claim that marrying and avoiding divorce shakes Allah's throne, or that naming a son Muhammad for blessing guarantees entry into Jannah, again, classified as fabricated. Then, there's the idea that loving your country is part of Iman, and that Allah will call people by their mother's names to cover them, but these are also not authentic. One important point to remember is that the heart of the Quran is Surah Yasin, and reading it once is said to carry the reward of reading the entire Quran 10 times. This is also classified as fabricated. There are other narrations about performing multiple tayammum for different salah, or about Madinah being holier than Makkah, and even sayings like, necessity knows no law. All these have been deemed fabricated by scholars like Ahmed ibn Hanbal and ad-Dahabi. The key takeaway here is to be very cautious and critical about such narrations. Not everything attributed to the Prophet is authentic. Our goal is to stick to sound, verified teachings, especially when it comes to matters of faith and practice. This helps us maintain the integrity of our religion and avoid falling into misconceptions. Thank you for being with me throughout this presentation. As we conclude, I want to remind you that this content is copyright 2024 by Continuous Learning Development. This signifies our ongoing commitment to growth and development. Remember, the key themes we've discussed, adaptability, continuous learning, and proactive growth, are essential for staying ahead in today's rapidly changing environment. Embracing these concepts not only enhances our individual skills, but also propels our organizations forward. Keep these ideas in mind as you apply what you've learned here. Thanks again for your time and engagement.